All right, hey folks, my name's Mark Locklear, and I'm going to talk for a little bit about NativeScript. So I titled this talk Mobile Development for Web Developers, and I sort of struggled a little bit on how I wanted to approach this. Essentially, I'm going to approach this talk from the standpoint of as a web developer who sort of came to mobile development or came to do some mobile development. I still wouldn't call myself a mobile developer, but I can say I've rolled an app out on the App Store and the Play Store, and I can say I've done some mobile development. That's all thanks to NativeScript. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about how I came to NativeScript and sort of how I found the framework. So about 8 months ago or so, back in the fall, I'm an adjunct instructor at a community college, and some folks from marketing came to me and said, "Hey, we've got," and I knew the college had a mobile application, but I didn't know much about the details of it. But they came to me and said, "Hey, we've got a mobile app, and we need some updates made to it. The developer's not here anymore. Would you be willing to look at it for us?" So we've all read this O'Reilly book before, right? The guy who wrote this is gone. Good luck figuring out other people's code. So I sort of, at first I said, no, I'm not a mobile developer. I don't know iOS. I don't know Swift. So no, I'm not interested in looking at it. But then they sort of came back again and asked. And so I said, okay, I'll take a look at it. So sort of to my surprise and delight, the code was well written, at least from just from a file and folder standpoint. The structure of the code was well laid out. It was easy to understand. So that sort of began my exploration of NativeScript and also Angular. I'll talk more about this later, but this particular NativeScript app was written in Angular, JavaScript, and so it was sort of my introduction to that framework too. So what is NativeScript? I'll tell you what it is, and then maybe we'll talk about what it's not to, and that'll help explain it. So I took this from Burke Holland, who was with NativeScript a few years ago. He gave a talk. A lot of what I'm talking about here I pulled from his talk he gave in November back in 2017. But his description of NativeScript is a runtime for building and running native, sort of air quotes there, iOS and Android apps from a single JavaScript code base, okay? And that's probably the best, most succinct description I've heard. What NativeScript is not. Sometimes when you're trying to understand something, it's good to understand what it's not. So it's not PhoneGap, Cordova, or Ionic. Those all use web views. Essentially, you're coding up a web view, and then you sort of hit the magic button, and it runs it through some gyrations, and you end up with a mobile app that's just displaying a web view. NativeScript is not that. It's also not React Native, but it's close, and I don't know all the details of React Native, but it's very close to React Native. So NativeScript uses real DOM or uses real native components. So when you create an iOS button inside a NativeScript app, when you compile and create an iOS app, you get a real iOS button. It's not an HTML button that's sort of wrapped up to look like an iOS button. It's an actual iOS button. There's no DOM to manipulate in NativeScript. Again, it's not a native view, so you can't do like get element by ID or something like that. And then there's also no HTML. So instead, NativeScript uses XML, and XML generally gets a bad rap, but it's actually pretty well implemented in NativeScript. The views are not terribly, they're not terribly nested. Like we've all probably seen XML before that looked like it was a mess. It's actually a pretty good implementation of XML as it relates to views, and it uses XML the way it's supposed to be, which is as a markup language. So it's used to mark up your views, and it's pretty well executed in NativeScript, and we'll see some of that during the live coding that I do. So this is sort of an example of we've got a NativeScript app on the left, and then a sort of web view type Ionic or Cordova app on the right. So you've got NativeScript code there in the middle. And then again, you've got 100% direct access to all native APIs, again, whether it's on iOS or on Android. And then you can see on the right, that's sort of a picture. You've got this web browser, this web view sort of in the middle there. And that when you're actually coding the app up, that's sort of what you're creating as a web view. And then you've got limited access to APIs, you know, depending on the implementation of the framework you're using. So I wanted to include a slide on this. I think that NativeScript is the closest I've seen to sort of fulfilling this this promise of true hybrid development. Now that means, at least in my mind, hybrid development means a couple of different things. Number one, hybrid in that you can code once and you get a native iOS and Android app. Now, that's not to say that you won't do some tweaking on both the iOS and the Android applications that you create, but the good thing is you've got an actual 100%, you know, true iOS and Android application. And in my mind, what you do is on a more sophisticated app. Now, again, depends on the app you're going to build. I think for your sort of average run-of-the-mill app that you're creating for someone, you really don't need to touch either the iOS or the Android app. If you've got a more sophisticated app, it's my sense that you might, like 90% of the, or 95% of the development is going to be done inside NativeScript, and then you're going to compile either the iOS or compile both the iOS and the Android app. Then you might hand those apps off to iOS and Android developers who might make some final tweaks to the views and the UI and those kinds of things. The logic itself, the sort of business logic of the app, I think, is not going to have to be touched, but there may be some UI tweaking that you would do inside the individual iOS and Android apps. So the second sort of hybrid, when we talk about hybrid development, this idea of web developers also being able to do web development too. And so I think NativeScript does an excellent job of that, that you can take someone that, now you need to know JavaScript. I mean, most web developers these days do. In fact, if you call yourself a web developer and you don't know JavaScript, then there's probably something wrong. But so you can take those JavaScript skills and then transfer those over to NativeScript. And then the other point I was going to make was about also if you're an Angular developer or Vue developer, and we'll talk more about this in a few slides, you can also take those skills because you can create either, from an architecture standpoint, when you create a NativeScript app, you can create either Angular or a Vue app in addition to regular TypeScript. And the final sort of hybrid, when we talk about hybrid development, is this the idea of reuse code across web and mobile. So I think the idea for me here is too, and I haven't seen this in the wild, but I think NativeScript gets you very close to this idea of being able to encapsulate business logic, and you can write that business logic once and use it on both the mobile side and on the desktop side. And so again, the way and again, if you're using Angular or Vue, I think that sort of that concept also applies to. But again, that same logic, the idea that we can write code and use it in both desktop and mobile is attainable in NativeScript. Alrighty, so what are our architecture options? So I've just got a screenshot of the command line interface for NativeScript. So when you create an app, you can see here I've got TNS create blah, which is the idea is we're creating an app called blah here. The first thing you get is NativeScript says which style of NativeScript project would you like to use, and then you can actually choose from the command line. You choose Angular, Vue, TypeScript, or JavaScript. So in the live coding I'm going to do later, I'll be using TypeScript, but again for Angular and Vue folks, that you can create and all the same things you do inside Angular or Vue, you can do inside NativeScript. So I stole this from another talk I found online. So under the hood of NativeScript, so starting at the top and sort of working our way down, you've got your app code is sort of at the top here. Then that next level, you can choose, again, JavaScript or TypeScript, Angular or Vue. next level down, sort of in the middle in purple, we see you've got NativeScript core modules. So all NativeScript apps are going to have those core, the sort of small set of core modules that are native or produced by NativeScript. Then there's also third-party plugins that are available. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. Then you've got the NativeScript runtime, access to native APIs, and then of course when you build the app, you've got both Android and iOS apps, and then of course the NativeScript command line. I'll be using the command line for the live coding exercise. I've got Progress, which is the company who owns NativeScript, also has a sort of GUI interface you can use to produce apps and then also track projects and things, and that's part of how they make money. Just a little bit on Progress, which is the company who owns I guess you would say manages NativeScript. NativeScript is fully open source, but they're sort of taking a Red Hat model, if you will, where they're giving the software away, but then they're selling these sort of services and tools around NativeScript. So you can, again, they've got a desktop management tool that's a GUI that allows you to create apps. Then you can also store projects, and it's sort of a freemium model where you've got so many projects you can create for free. But then if you want more than that, if you want to add collaborators and other folks to it, then that's when you have to pay them money. But that's sort of the model they're taking with this. Okay, so let's talk about third-party plugins or off-the-shelf things. So for Android folks, Android Arsenal, I'm told, I'm not an Android developer, but I'm told that's a popular tool for third-party plugins and things. All of those things you have access to inside NativeScript. CocoaPods for iOS folks, you've got access to those. NativeScript plugins, so there's a whole third-party marketplace for NativeScript plugins. I mean, there's hundreds, if not maybe thousands of them out there now that are available to you inside NativeScript. And then NPM is the other thing. I mean, NativeScript itself is served up and installed via NPM, at least the command line tool is. And anything that's available in that's available in NPM, you can use inside NativeScript now. And so, like Moment.js in this example, you can use that inside NativeScript. Any package or JavaScript framework, UI framework that's available via NPM, you can add to a project and use inside NativeScript. Now, the caveat is it can't have a web view. It can't depend on a web view. As I mentioned earlier, a few slides back, there's no web views, there's no DOM, document object model inside NativeScript. So it can't, if it has a dependency on those things, you can't use it inside NativeScript. As long as it does not have a web view and you have access to it, you can use it inside your NativeScript app. And in fact, so yeah, you can see I've got a sort of a screen grab of the NPM website where I searched for NativeScript. Notice there's almost 1,200 packages that are available there. This is a screen grab I took from Burke Holland's talk he gave in 2017, so about a year and a half ago. And you notice there were only 342 then. So you can see, I mean, it's almost tripled in a year and a half the number of packages that are available for NPM. So there's definitely, I mean, that's the other thing that I found I was pleasantly surprised with NativeScript is the amount of not only the community support, so questions on Stack Overflow, they've got a Slack channel that you can get help there, but in addition to that, also the sort of plug-in ecosystem. So, think if you're a Ruby on Rails gal, think about Ruby gems and the amount of support there. And then if you're a Django developer, think about Python eggs, those kind of things. So what are the pain points? This was just when I talk about pain points, me, again, as from a web developer's perspective, someone who's not a mobile developer, what was the experience like, not only setting the framework up, but sort of getting to know the framework and then being able to actually deploy a live app. So dev environment was the first one I've got listed here, and that's probably, we've all been there from a web development standpoint, trying out a new framework. There's usually spend up hours, if not days, sort of tweaking your local environment, getting that so you can actually use the framework and create apps. So that was certainly a hurdle. And the hurdle there was not so much. I mean, the NativeScript itself is fairly painless. It was very painless on Mac. In fact, I didn't have any issues. I've got an Ubuntu or an Ubuntu laptop where I did have some issues setting it up there. But the the framework itself for NativeScript was not terrible to set up. I think the associated stuff was the sort of pain point, and that is on iOS. If you're going to develop iOS apps, then you have to be on a Mac with NativeScript. And then, of course, you've got to have Xcode installed and getting the Xcode dev tools, and then getting the emulators or simulators, I think is what Apple calls them on the iOS side. Getting simulators set up is somewhat of a pain. And, keep in mind for each type of iPhone, a version of iPhone, iPhone 5, iPhone 6, iPhone 8, iPhone 8 Plus, there's a simulator for each one of those that has to be set up. And then on the Android side, the same thing. And think about the dozens and dozens of different Android platforms or Android devices that are out there. Each of those devices has its own emulator that has to be installed and set up locally. So that just getting all that environment set up. When I do the live coding exercise here shortly, I'll be using iOS for that, so you'll get to see what that looks like. But that is sort of a chore to get all that set up and working, so you can actually, that's before you write any code or work on any logic or do anything inside that. Testing was the other big piece, and when I say testing, I'm not talking about code or automated testing here. I just mean manually running the app, and like prior to deploying it to the App Store or making it available to the public, there's a fair amount of testing you have to do. And I guess from a web developer's perspective, it's similar to testing on different web browsers, but you sort of need to do some due diligence on what devices that you test on. Android was a particular pain point for me. I only tested on a handful of Android devices locally, and then when you deploy to either the App Store or the Play Store for Android, you can you can invite individuals, including yourself, so you can make the app available on those platforms, on the App Store or the Play Store, and then you can make it so it's not available to the public. It's only available to an individual person, so that person can download the app and test it locally on their device. So that's just like a whole thing. And then this third point I've got here goes along with that too. The whole process of rolling out an app to the App Store or Google Play is like a whole thing, and it sounds like you end up reading a lot of Stack Overflow posts and things, because things change and it's a little different each time. And for iOS, you have to have what's called a provisioning certificate locally to be able to test, and there's a lot that's wrapped up in that. So now after having gone through the process, I sort of understand why mobile application development can be so expensive, because it's very time consuming to go through all those things. So here's the app that we're going to build. So this is a beer app. In fact, I'm going to sort of use that as a guide for the tutorial I'm going to do here, or the app I'm going to build here. But I've got a technical blog post on medium.com. If you go to medium.com/@marklocklear, if you just sort of look down the list of articles, I'm not sure if it was the last article I did or not, but you can sort of, I've got a tutorial there that'll walk you through creating this beer app. So just basically what we're going to do here, this is a really simple one-page app. We're going to create a new NativeScript app. You'll get to see the sort of off-the-shelf app that's created by default, and then we'll modify that. We'll get data from a JSON feed. There's a beertutorials.org, I think is what it is. We'll see it in a second here. I'll show it to you. But essentially, it's just a JSON feed that's available online. We'll take and create our view, and then we've got a Get Me Beers button, and you'll click that button, and it'll pull that JSON dump down, and then we'll add some CSS and some styling to display it on the screen. So without further ado, move this out of the way. I'll get our command line going. Hopefully you can see this. I'll increase this just a tad. Okay, so we'll go to NativeScript So we'll do, so TNS is the command that for the command line tool for NativeScript that you use to create NativeScript apps. There's some sort of historical stuff with why it's called TNS. Telerik is the original company who developed NativeScript, and then Progress purchased the rights to it a few years ago, and they own it now. So the TNS, the T in that is for, I think, Telerik NativeScript is what that is. But we'll do TNS create, and I'm just going to call it my beer app. So what's going to happen is we get a series of questions. So here's the image we saw earlier on the slide that I had. And so again, here we can choose Angular Native or Angular Vue, TypeScript or JavaScript. I'm going to choose TypeScript. And again, big advantage here for Angular and Vue developers. If you've got skills in those frameworks, you're able to apply those things here and do pretty amazing work. So I'll choose TypeScript. This was just added, I think, in version 4 or 5, just the last less than a year, where you can sort of choose what type of app. You can go online and look at more options there, but you can choose Hello World. A side drawer basically is, you've probably seen it before, sort of has the menu going down the side, and you can choose various things to use to choose various pages inside the app. But we're going to choose the Hello World app, and then this is going to go through some gyrations. So I'm giving this talk, now I'm recording this, I'm going to make this available on YouTube. I'm giving this in preparation for giving this talk at Southern DevCon down in Augusta in April of 2018. So this is sort of my dry run of that talk. Okay, so we can see we got a message that says the project is successfully created, so we'll change directory into that, and then we'll start up our code, VS Code. So VS Code is sort of the, VS Code is the IDE of choice for NativeScript. Basically, that's because everything's done in TypeScript, either TypeScript, Angular, or Vue. For Angular, VS Code. For Angular, most everything's done in TypeScript, so therefore VS Code is sort of the IDE of choice. I'm not sure about Vue folks, but just to show you the file and folder structure, really this is it here. This app.ts, and really the only thing we're going to be touching for this talk is main.ts and main.xml. Let me go ahead and increase the size of that just so you can see it a little better. Okay, so we'll switch back over to our command line here, and so we'll go ahead and start our emulator up so we can just sort of see what this out of the box app looks like. So we'll go TNS run iOS. So again, this is Mac folks only. If you're doing iOS, I could start this up on Android too if I wanted, but I've already got the emulator and Xcode and all that configured. So when we do this, hopefully we'll get an emulator in a few seconds. So the searching for devices, those are devices that are already configured within Xcode. And then here's our emulator, just popped up on my other monitor, so hopefully you can see that. This is a 6. I think this emulator is an iPhone 6. I mean, the other cool thing here is that you'll be able to see once we boot this up that as we make changes, you can sort of, you've got this live view, and this is similar for other frameworks, Webpack and other frameworks that web developers are used to working with. Of course, as you make your changes inside the code and save them, then they're going to show up on this live device here. So you see there, it's building the project. So it's actually building a live, iOS app. Installing on device, and so if I flip back here, we can see the device or the app start to appear. So out of the box, all of this was created by just choosing that Hello World app. And So you can tap this button, and as it clicks all the way down, in fact, we can look at some of this code inside inside our app here. Here's our tap, button text tap, and then on tap. And again, especially for Angular folks, this probably looks familiar. And then inside this TNS here, notice this is the counter is going on, and that's when the counter goes down each time we're clicking. And then you can see here you've got this hello or hooray unlocked NativeScript clicker. So we won't click that all the way down, but that's sort of what that looks like. Okay, so on my other screen here, I've got my beer app tutorial up. So I'm just gonna follow on there, and we'll see how things go. So the first thing we'll do is inside main page.xml. So that XML that I mentioned earlier. So again, views inside, and I'll take out some of these comments and that'll help maybe give you an idea of what. You can see this XML is not terribly complicated, right? I mean, we don't have a terribly complicated view at the moment, but you can see, as again, coming from a web developer background, all of this should be pretty straightforward. You just simply got some nested views, open and close tags here, title, some text, and then we're doing some sort of embedded JavaScript or TypeScript in this case. So that's sort of what all that is. So the first thing we'll do is let's just modify this, and I'm just going to highlight all of it and paste that in. Now what's going to happen here is we do this, we should see this. We saw some sort of gyrations in the background here, and not updating. I'm going to just pause this for 1 second. Okay, so I did have to pause that for 1 second just to restart the app and this. So you can see now all I did was paste it in essentially what we had there before. I just changed the title, and then I'm calling, I mentioned earlier that NativeScript has a core set of modules that are included with it. And again, this view, this XML view, it has its own set. So this sort of button primary, button active, these things are going to look very similar to something like Bootstrap or other UI frameworks that you've seen. So NativeScript has its own sort of core set of UI elements that it can use to produce these views. So in this case, I've created a button. I've added the text "Get Me Beers" to it, and then if we look over in the simulator, you can see it. And of course, it doesn't do anything right now. And in fact, if we go to and we're not even doing a click event. I think we'll add a click event here in a second. So when we click this, maybe we'll see something inside the console. But the next thing we'll do is go down, and then inside main page.ts, so that's going to be here. I'm just going to highlight all of this and paste in this code. So this is real simple, right? We've just got this export beers function that we're going to call, and when we click it, we're going to do a console log that says export beers function called. And in fact, we go back to our app and we click that. If you'll notice in the background, you should be able to see here, notice here's our console log, okay? So the only point there, the only thing we want to highlight is that we've sort of connected this view that we've got. We've connected this view, and we've connected this button to this export beers function. And in fact, let me make this a little smaller so we can see. Yeah. So let's move on to our next step so we can see our console log. So now if we look, let's add a little more functionality to our that main page. .ts. It's a little smaller so I can see it. Wrong one. Let's do that. So a couple things here. Again, if you've done Angular before, or really any kind of JavaScript framework, even React, these import statements are going to look similar. So again, at the top here, we're going to be importing this getJSON method. That's coming from the HTTP TNS core module. And then we're calling this getJSON function here. Here is our JSON. If we could view this link in a web browser, and it would just show us pretty typical JSON. So we're calling this JSON method, and when we do, we're going to console log out that data we're getting from this JSON call, and we're just going to print it out on the screen. It's actually not going to work, but you know it's not going to work, and I'll show you what's going to happen there. So you notice, in fact, you notice when I save that, you notice you get the refresh inside the simulator, and you also got some stuff that happened inside the console here. So now when I click the Get Me Beers function, well, we're not quite getting JSON, right? And so what we're actually getting here is a, let's see what the actual error is. Resource could not be loaded because app transport security policy requires use of a secure connection. So you've probably seen this before on apps. Essentially, this is a cross-browser, whatever error. Basically, it's a security feature of the framework, and this is inside the specific iOS app. So again, I've got this sort of caveat inside my blog post. Anytime you're grabbing live HTTP data, and if I had this HTTP server running locally, I think it would be okay to get it. You don't have to make this change. But we're going to have to make some modifications to our info.plist inside our mobile app. So if I search here, plist, yeah. So inside app resources, iOS, notice we've got an info.plist there. So I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And I'm just going to grab this from my blog post. And this needs to go to a specific spot. It needs to go just above the final closing big tab, which is right here. So we'll paste that in and save it. I think I'm going to have to restart the app for this to work. Let's let it build. We'll see. The other thing is, notice most of this is happening fairly fast. I mean, this is a major, this info.plist is a major sort of change you're making to the sort of core part of an iOS app. But most of these refreshes, once you get into the workflow, most of the refreshes between the code and what's happening in the simulator happens fairly fast. So it's kind of nice. I mean, I found the workflow really pleasant. Okay, so this is refreshed, and so now, yeah, so I didn't have to restart the device. Notice when I click the Get Me Beers button now, let me refresh this, go back up here and I click it, you can see it pop up on the screen. Notice I'm getting good old-fashioned JSON here. So we see this is nice. Now it's going to be pretty easy to manipulate this data in our view, okay? So again, still not doing anything inside the app, but hey, we're getting some data back from our HTTP call we're doing, so this is a good thing. So now I'm going to paste in some code for our main page, our main.ts. Let's go back to that. Okay, so let's make that a little bigger, too big. Okay, so a couple more imports we're going to do here. We're going to create an observable. Again, I don't know how. I know in Angular that's a thing. I've learned that the last few months, but an observable allows us basically to create an array from the JSON data that we're getting. So we're importing these two observable array and observable modules. Again, those are all part of TNS core. Creating a couple of variables at the top. We're doing that same JSON get JSON that we were doing earlier. However, this time we're creating we've got a beer list array here, which in this case is an observable array. We've got a simple JavaScript for loop here. And as we loop through each one of these JSON elements, we're going to do a push. Most of us should be familiar with what that is. We're going to actually add that to that beer list array. And then now at the bottom, here's the sort of last thing we need to do. We've got this page loaded function, and that action needs to be added to our view. And make sure. So let's go ahead and, in fact, let's go ahead and update our view now. So that's on mainpage.ts. We'll save that. And then our XML is going to turn into this. So again, we've added a few more things, but again, not terribly complicated. I'll just say a couple things about it here. We're adding a title at the top. This particular stack layout is again, NativeScript's implementation of a page view. We've got a vertical page view here. Here's our button, our Get Me Beers button, where we're setting the height. The Listview Items is basically sort of, again, from an Angular standpoint, if you've done an NG4 before, we're going to that Listview Items is going to allow you to loop through. In this case, the array is going to be beer list, and that's the beer list that we're creating over in the export beers function. And then inside here, you notice we're doing again these sort of double curly braces are the pieces of data that we're going to display the name. And then we're also displaying our image. We're also displaying our image inside here too. I'm not seeing it right now, but yeah, here it is right here. Yeah. So we're displaying the image. We're setting just a width and a height on the image, and then we're also displaying the name. So let's save all that, and let's see what we get. So over in our app, we click to Get Me Beers, and there you go. It's going to loop through these. In fact, in this case, I think it adds sort of 10 beers each time. I think there are 10 here, and then if we add it again, you notice it updated and added another 10. So that's a really simplified example of what NativeScript is. I mean, I think it's pretty cool with it in. You know, when you look at the amount of code we've got here, you know, we've got less than 100 lines of code in both the sort of business logic and inside the view that's allowing us to do something like what you see here. So I was real pleased with it. Just to sort of finish up my story, I told in the beginning how I came to NativeScript. Again, I agreed to look at this app for the community college that I'm an adjunct instructor with. And I was able to sort of fix, they had a few bugs in there. I was able to update the version that they had. It was a couple of years old, in addition to sort of make some fixes that they for some bugs that they had, in addition to rolling the new version of the app out. So I guess my closing thoughts are that as for web developers, if you're thinking about a framework for mobile development, I would encourage you to look at NativeScript and you know, treat it just like any other new framework. That, you know, I usually like to give a framework 30 minutes to an hour just to see if I can get it installed and up and running. Probably going to take a little longer than that, just because, not because of the NativeScript, the mobile framework, but because of the emulators and those things that in itself might take, you know, a little more time. But you could certainly throw a few hours at it over a couple of days, maybe, and I think you would have your local development environment set up, and you can begin to experiment with it. So that's all for now. Tweet at me at Mark Locklear if you have questions, and thanks for watching this.